The dust hung thick in the air of the Bee-Line diner, a permanent haze of fried bacon and stale coffee that clung to the red vinyl booths. It was August of '77, and the air outside was as hot and heavy as a wet wool blanket. Inside, the talk was all about the corn. It was a bumper crop, maybe the best anyone had ever seen. The stalk stood 10 feet tall, ears fat and heavy, promising a record harvest and prices that made a man's head spin. At the center of the noise, holding court from the corner booth, was Richard Thompson. Rich, as he insisted everyone call him, wasn't from here, not really. He'd bought the old Miller place 5 years back when land was still cheap, coming in with a business degree and a line of credit from a big city bank that made the local loan officers blush. He farmed with a checkbook, not his hands, and every year his operation got bigger, shinier, and deeper in debt. And the grain tank on this new 7700 turbo, I tell you, it's a monster, Rich was saying, his voice booming over the clatter of plates. He gestured with a soft, uncalloused hand. We can fill a semi in 3 dumps. 3. We'll be done with our 2,000 acres before Silas here even gets that museum piece of his fired up. He winked across the room at me. I was sitting at the counter, nursing a cup of black coffee, trying to ignore him. My name is Silas Blackwood. I farm the same quarter section my grandfather broke with a team of mules. I don't owe any man a dime, and the only banker I talk to is the one who cashes my grain checks. A few of the other farmers in the booth with Rich chuckled. They were good men, most of them, but they were caught up in the fever. The '70s were a crazy time. Land prices doubled, then doubled again. Corn was $4 a bushel. The government was telling us to plant fence row to fence row to feed the world, and the banks were practically begging us to take their money. It felt like the good times would never end, and Rich Thompson was their king. What model is that thing you're running, Si? One of them, a younger fellow named Pete, asked. He was trying to be friendly, but his eyes had that pitying look I was getting used to. It's a Massey Ferguson 510, I said, my voice low. I didn't look up from my coffee cup. Rich let out a short, sharp laugh. A 510? My God, Silas, they stopped making those 10 years ago. Does it still have the crank start? More laughter. I felt my neck get hot. My Massey was a 68, a good machine. Simple. I knew every bolt, every belt, every grease zerk on her. She had a 6-cylinder Perkins diesel that sipped fuel and a cast-iron grit that modern machines couldn't dream of. She didn't have an air-conditioned cab or a stereo, but she was paid for. That meant more to me than anything. She runs fine, I said, finally turning on my stool to face them. I looked past Rich and at the other men. She'll get the crop in, same as she does every year. Rich leaned forward, his smile all teeth. But this isn't just any year, Silas. This is the big one. You can't afford a breakdown with corn this good. That old relic. It can't handle this. You'll be halfway through your first field when a belt snaps, and you'll spend 2 days tracking down a part for it. Meanwhile, my new John Deere and I will be eating up 150 acres a day. When you're finally ready to give up, give me a call. My custom rates are high, but I might give an old-timer like you a discount. The silence that followed was heavy. He hadn't just insulted my machine. He'd insulted my father, and his father before him. He'd called our whole way of life, our belief in self-reliance, and living within our means, a relic. I pushed my coffee cup away, the ceramic scraping against the Formica counter. I stood up, pulling a few crumpled dollar bills from my pocket and laying them down. I was a big man, not tall, but wide through the shoulders from a lifetime of wrestling with iron and earth. My hands were thick and stained with grease that no soap could ever fully remove. I walked over to their booth and stood at the end of it, looking right at Rich Thompson. His smile faltered for just a second. "My combine will do just fine, Rich," I said, my voice as flat and hard as the prairie in January. "And when the harvest is over, we'll see who's standing on solid ground and who's standing on a pile of debt." I turned and walked out, the little bell on the diner door jingling behind me. The heat hit me like a physical blow. I stood there for a moment by my old Ford F-100. Its paint faded to a dull blue, and I could feel their eyes on me through the big plate glass window. I wasn't just a farmer. I was a ghost from a past they were all trying to outrun. My father's words echoed in my head, as clear as if he were standing right next to me. "Son," he'd said, a week before the cancer took him, "this land doesn't care if your tractor is new or old. It only cares if you're smart. Don't ever let a banker own your sweat. You own the iron, or the iron owns you." I climbed into my truck, the vinyl seat hot enough to burn. I thought about that old Massey 510 sitting in the machine shed. I thought about the work ahead of me, the long days and nights of tuning and tinkering to get her ready. And I thought about Rich Thompson's shiny green monster. He was right about one thing. This year was different. This year felt like a turning point, a final stand between the old ways and the new. Now, before we go any further with this story, I have to ask you something. Have you ever had someone doubt you like that? Someone look at what you built with your own 2 hands, something you poured your heart and soul into, and call it junk? Maybe it was an old truck, a set of tools you inherited, or a business you started from scratch. Let me know down in the comments what piece of old iron you still swear by, the one that never let you down when the whole world said it would. I'd sure like to hear about it. The 2 weeks before harvest were my ritual. They were a conversation between me, the machine, and the ghosts of my father and grandfather. The machine shed was my sanctuary. The air inside was cool and smelled of damp earth, diesel fuel, and old oil. Light streamed in through the dusty windows, illuminating the hulking red form of the Massey Ferguson 510. She wasn't pretty. Her paint was faded and chipped, with streaks of rust bleeding from the joints. Dents and welded patches told the story of a decade of hard work, of encounters with rocks and washouts. But to me, she had a rugged beauty that no brand new machine could match. I started at the front with the 15-foot grain header. I crawled underneath it, my creeper rolling over the cracked concrete floor. First thing was the sickle bar. I pulled each triangular knife section, one by one, sharpening them on the bench grinder until they had an edge that could shave the hair off your arm. I checked the guards, tightening the bolts, replacing 2 that were cracked. I ran my fingers along the reel bats, feeling for splintered wood, and checked the tension on the chain that drove it. This was slow, methodical work. It was the kind of work Rich Thompson paid a dealership mechanic $200 an hour to do. I did it for the price of a few grinding wheels and a little skin off my knuckles. Next, I moved to the guts of the machine. I pulled the rock trap and cleaned it out, finding a few good-sized stones from last year's soybeans. Then came the heart of the combine, the cylinder and concave. I opened the big inspection door and shone my trouble light inside. The rasp bars on the cylinder were worn, the edges rounded over. They wouldn't thresh the corn cleanly, leaving valuable kernels still on the cob. Replacing them was a miserable job. The bolts were seized with rust and chaff. I soaked them in penetrating oil for a day, then went at them with a 3/4-inch impact wrench, the loud hammering echoing through the shed. One by one, with a grunt and a shower of rust, they broke free. I wrestled the heavy new bars into place, torquing them down to spec, my muscles burning. While I had it open, I checked the concave clearance, using a set of feeler gauges to get it just right. Too tight, and you crack the corn. Too loose, and you don't get it all off the cob. It was a fine balance, an art you learned from experience, not from a manual. The community, what was left of the old guard anyway, watched me with a quiet understanding. Old man Hemlock, who farmed the 80 acres north of me with a Farmel M he bought in 1950, stopped by one afternoon. He didn't say much. He just stood there, chewing on a piece of hay, and watched me splice a new section into the clean grain elevator chain. "Thompson's running 2 of them now," he finally said, spitting. "Bought another one, bigger than the first." "I heard," I said, not looking up from the master link I was trying to fasten. "He's got the bank behind him," Hemlock said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "The bank's always behind you," I grunted, finally getting the pin to slide into place, "right up until they're in front of you, blocking the door." He nodded slowly, his eyes scanning my old Massey. "Your father would be proud, Silas. You know your iron." He didn't say anything else, just turned and ambled back to his truck, but it was enough. It was a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone in my thinking, but Hemlock was the exception. The scorn from the younger generation was palpable. They'd drive by my place in their new pickups, slowing down to stare at the old 510 sitting out in the yard. I could hear their thoughts as clearly as if they'd shouted them. "Look at that poor fool, trying to fight a war with a slingshot." Pete, the young farmer from the diner, even stopped in one day, ostensibly to ask about borrowing a post-hole digger. But I knew his real reason. He was curious, like a man visiting a museum. "She's got a lot of character," he said, kicking one of the Massey's big drive tires. "She's paid for," I replied, wiping grease from my hands with a rag. "Yeah, but Rich says the new machines, they pay for themselves in efficiency. Less grain loss, faster ground speed. He figures he gains 5 bushels to the acre over a machine like this." 5 bushels to the acre. It was the new gospel, preached by the salesmen in their shiny polo shirts. They'd come around with glossy brochures filled with charts and graphs, showing how their new combines could practically mint money. They never showed you the other chart, the one with the loan payments that stretched out for 10 years, the one with the interest rates that could choke a horse. "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe he loses 10 bushels to the acre in soil compaction from running a 30,000-pound machine over his fields. And maybe he loses his whole farm when the price of corn drops, and he can't make that $100,000 payment." Pete just shook his head and mumbled something about having to get going. He didn't get it. None of them did. They saw my old machine as a liability. I saw it as my freedom. The day before I planned to start, disaster struck. I was doing a final check, running the machine at low idle when I saw it. A dark, steady drip from beneath the engine, hydraulic fluid. I shut her down and crawled underneath. A main pressure line, the one that ran the header lift, had rubbed against the frame for years, and a pinhole had finally worn through. It wasn't a big leak, but under the 2,000 psi of operating pressure, it would spray fluid like a fire hose. My heart sank. It was a specialized pre-bent steel line, not something you could just replace with a rubber hose. The local parts store just laughed when I told them what I needed. "Massey 510? Silas, we haven't seen one of those parts in 5 years. You'll have to go to a salvage yard." The nearest big salvage yard was 100 miles away. That was a day lost. A whole day, with perfect weather in the forecast and the corn drying down fast in the field. As I drove my old Ford down the highway, I saw Rich Thompson's operation in full swing. His brand-new 7700 was cutting a massive swath through a field bordering the road, a cloud of dust and chaff billowing behind it. It moved with an implacable, arrogant speed. I could see Rich in the glass-enclosed cab, cool and comfortable, steering with one hand. He was winning, and I was on my way to a junkyard. For the first time, a sliver of real doubt worked its way into my heart. Maybe they were right. Maybe my father's ways were dead and gone, and I was just too stubborn to bury them. The 1970s roared on, a golden age for the American farmer. The grain deal with the Soviets had opened the floodgates, and the world, it seemed, had an insatiable appetite for our corn and soybeans. Prices stayed high, climbing year after year. Land that my father had struggled to pay off at $200 an acre was now selling for $2,000, and there were buyers lining up. The mantra from the Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, echoed across the plains, "Get big or get out." Rich Thompson took that mantra to heart. He became the living embodiment of the boom. The profits from that record harvest in '77, all of it on paper and leveraged to the hilt, were just the beginning. He used his projected income to secure another massive loan and bought the quarter section bordering my west fence row when Old Man Hemlock finally decided to retire. He didn't even haggle on the price. He just wrote a check that made the old man's eyes water. Then came the new iron. A monstrous John Deere 8820 combine arrived on a flatbed truck, a machine so large it looked like it belonged on a different planet. It had an 8-row corn head and a 24-foot grain platform. It was a titan, designed to devour entire fields in a single pass. To support it, he bought a brand-new 4-wheel drive John Deere 80-40 tractor, with duals on all 4 wheels and a cab that looked like the cockpit of an airplane. He ploughed under Hemlock's old pasture, tore out the windbreaks my grandfather had helped plant, and turned it all into one vast, featureless field of corn. His farm wasn't a farm anymore. It was an industrial site. The talk at the diner was all about his success. "Did you see the lights on Rich's new planter? He was working till midnight last night," they'd say. "Heard he's renting another 300 acres over by the river." He was a hero, a visionary who was capitalizing on the good times. He was building an empire. And I just kept on. That '77 harvest had been a nail-biter. I'd found the hydraulic line at the salvage yard and lost only a day and a half. My old Massey ran like a top after that, chugging along at her slow, steady pace. I didn't set any speed records, but at the end of every day, the grain bin was a little fuller. When it was all said and done, I'd had my most profitable year ever. The corn yield was incredible, and the prices were a gift from heaven. I had a choice to make. With that money, I could have made a down payment on a new combine myself. I could have bought the 40 acres for sale down the road. I could have joined the party. The banker, a young man who had replaced my father's old friend, practically begged me to. "Silas, with your assets, we could approve you for a $500,000 line of credit tomorrow. You're sitting on a gold mine, but you're not digging." I looked at him across his big mahogany desk. "And what's the interest rate on that $500,000? "Well, rates are climbing a bit," he admitted, shuffling some papers. "Inflation, you know. But we're looking at maybe 12% right now. It's the cost of doing business." 12%. The word sent a chill down my spine. My father had once told me that any farmer who paid more than 5% interest was working for the bank, not for himself. Instead of taking his loan, I took my profits and walked across the street to the hardware store. I paid cash to put a new steel roof on the barn. I bought a new set of Firestones for my old International 1066. I replaced the worn-out auger in my grain bin. The rest, a solid chunk of cash, I put into a savings bond at the post office. It was a boring, safe, and, in the eyes of my neighbors, foolish move. "He's afraid," I heard Pete tell someone at the co-op. "Got a pile of cash and he's too scared to use it. Rich is building a legacy, and Silas is patching a roof." It was a lonely feeling. I was an island of caution in an ocean of aggressive optimism. Every time Rich Thompson drove by in his new air-conditioned pickup, he'd give me a little wave, a pitying smirk on his face. He saw me as a failure, a relic who was missing the single greatest opportunity in the history of agriculture. My discipline was seen as cowardice. My self-reliance was seen as stubborn foolishness. Even I began to wonder. The boom had lasted for years now. Maybe this time it was different. Maybe the old rules didn't apply anymore. I kept my head down and worked. I maintained my equipment with religious devotion. I rotated my crops, planting alfalfa on a tired field to replenish the nitrogen, while everyone else was planting corn on corn, sucking the life out of the soil. I was tending to the roots of my farm, while they were all reaching for the sky. Then, one evening in the late fall of 1979, I was in the house, cleaning the filters on the furnace before winter set in. The radio was on, playing softly in the kitchen. A news report came on. I didn't usually pay much attention to the national news. It all seemed a world away. But a few words caught my ear. The announcer was talking about the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, a man named Paul Volcker. He was talking about combating inflation and monetary policy. And then he said the phrase that made me stop what I was doing and turn up the volume: a significant and sustained increase in the federal funds rate. I didn't have a business degree like Rich Thompson, but I knew what that meant. It meant the cost of borrowing money was about to go through the roof. It meant the cheap credit that was fueling the entire farm boom was about to be shut off. I walked to the window and looked out across the darkened fields toward the west. In the distance, I could see the yard lights of Rich's massive operation, blazing like a small city in the middle of the prairie. He was out there somewhere, probably in his heated shop, polishing the chrome on one of his new machines, dreaming of the empire he was going to build next year. The radio announcer's voice droned on about economic forecasts and market reactions, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was listening to a different sound, a faint rumbling on the horizon. It was the sound of a storm coming, a big one, and I knew, right down in my bones, that most of my neighbors, drunk on the good times and leveraged to the breaking point, had forgotten how to build an ark. The spring of 1980 broke wet and promising, washing away the last of the winter chill. The optimism that had been simmering for years boiled over once again. Rich Thompson planted his Empire fence row to fence row, his massive 8640 tractor and 24-row planter, working day and night, its halogen lights carving up the darkness. The talk at the diner was of another record year, another jump in land prices. The storm I had sensed seemed a distant fantasy. Then the rain stopped. It didn't just taper off, it vanished. June came and went, with a few scattered showers that barely settled the dust. By July, the sky was a pale, bleached-out sheet of white, and the sun was a merciless hammer. The corn, which had sprung up so green and hopeful, began to suffer. The broad leaves curled in on themselves by midday, trying to conserve what little moisture they had. The tassels emerged stunted and pale. The rich black soil of our county turned to a cracked, grey concrete. The heat was a living thing. It shimmered off the asphalt roads and baked the paint on my old Ford truck. The air was so dry, it felt like you were breathing dust. Day after day, we'd look at the sky, praying for a cloud, a hint of relief. But none came. The golden age was turning to brass. I watched my own crop struggle, my heart aching with each wilting stalk. But my worry was different from the others. A bad year for me meant a lean winter. For men like Rich Thompson, it meant ruin. His operating loan for that year alone was more than my entire farm was worth. He needed 200 bushels to the acre just to pay the interest on his debt. He was going to be lucky to get 80. The first real crack in his facade appeared in late August. One of his center pivot irrigation rigs, another massive expensive purchase, sputtered and died. The well couldn't keep up. He'd been sucking the aquifer dry. The giant machine stood motionless in his field, a monument to a failed bet against the sky. The real trouble started during the harvest. What little corn there was had dried down fast on the stalk, the kernels small and brittle. Rich fired up his gleaming John Deere 8820, the Titan that was supposed to be his flagship, and went to work. He hadn't even finished his first 100 acres when it happened. I was out in my own field, chugging along on the Massey, when I saw the cloud of dust from his machine stop. It just sat there, in the middle of a pass, for the rest of the afternoon. The next morning, I saw the dealership's service truck parked beside it. The talk at the parts counter, later that day, told the story. It wasn't a simple mechanical failure, not a belt or a chain he could fix himself. It was something deep in the guts of the machine's complex electro-hydraulic system. A solenoid valve in the main control block that governed the header height and reel speed had failed. The young mechanic, barely out of trade school, had spent a whole day with a diagnostic computer plugged into it, only to tell Rich the part wasn't in stock anywhere in the state. It had to be flown in from the factory in Moline. The cost of the part was $800. The cost of the service call and the downtime was incalculable. For 4 perfect harvesting days, Rich Thompson's $80,000 super combine sat idle, a silent green giant in a dying field. He was frantic. I'd see him driving back and forth on the county road, a plume of dust trailing his pickup, his face a mask of stress. He tried to hire a custom crew, but with the drought shortening the harvest window, everyone was working around the clock on their own fields. Meanwhile, I kept going. My Massey 510 didn't have any solenoid valves. It didn't have a computer. Its functions were controlled by simple hydraulic levers and steel cables. One morning, the belt that drove the straw walkers started to squeal, stretched and worn from years of service. I shut her down, walked back to my shop, and pulled a new belt, which I'd had hanging on a nail for 3 years, off the wall. I spent 30 minutes loosening the tensioner pulley, wrestling the new belt on and tightening it back up. An hour after I'd stopped, I was back in the field. The steady thrum of the Perkins diesel, a comforting rhythm against the prairie silence. The cost of my repair was $17, and a little bit of grease on my hands. On the 3rd day of Rich's breakdown, he pulled his truck up to the edge of my field. I saw him coming and stopped the combine at the end of a row, climbing down from the operator's platform. He got out of his truck, the air conditioning spilling out into the 100-degree heat. He looked tired. The arrogance was gone from his eyes, replaced by a desperate, hunted look. "Silas," he said, his voice raspy. He kicked at a dirt clod. That thing you're driving, it's actually running." "She always runs," I said, pulling a grease gun from the toolbox on the side of the combine. It was my lunchtime ritual, a few pumps of grease into the main bearings while the engine cooled. He watched me for a moment, the rhythmic squeak of the grease gun the only sound between us. "They say the part for my Deere will be here tomorrow." "Maybe." He shook his head. $1 million in equipment. and I'm paralyzed by a part the size of my fist. He looked at my old Massey, really looked at it, for the first time. He wasn't seeing a museum piece anymore. He was seeing a machine that worked. "How do you do it?" he asked, the question genuine. "How do you keep this old junk going?" The word junk didn't even sting this time. It just sounded sad. "She's not junk," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "She's simple. I know every bolt on her. I know the sounds she makes when she's healthy and the sounds she makes when she's hurting. I don't need a computer to tell me what's wrong. Your machine is smarter, Rich, but mine is wiser." He didn't have an answer for that. He just nodded, got back in his truck, and drove away. I watched him go, then climbed back up onto my combine, fired up the old diesel, and went back to work, slowly, steadily, saving my farm one row at a time. The part for Rich's combine arrived, but the damage was done. The drought of 1980 was just the opening salvo. The real war was being waged in boardrooms and banks, far from our dusty fields. Paul Volcker's Federal Reserve kept its foot on the throat of inflation, and interest rates, which had seemed high at 12%, began a relentless, terrifying climb. 14%. 16. 18. By 1981, the prime rate hit an unimaginable 21.5%. For farmers who had borrowed on variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. The letters from the bank started arriving in mailboxes all up and down the county road. First, they were polite reminders. Then they became firm demands. Loan payments doubled, then tripled, at the exact moment the income from our drought-stricken crops was cut in half. It was a perfect storm of economic devastation. The second pillar of the boom, soaring land values, crumbled next. With credit impossible to get and farm income non-existent, nobody was buying land. The market froze, then fell, then collapsed. Land that had been appraised at $2,000 an acre, the collateral against which all those massive loans had been written, was suddenly worth less than $1,000. Farmers who had thought they were millionaires on paper woke up to find they were bankrupt. The Beeline diner grew quiet. The boisterous talk of expansion and new equipment was replaced by hushed, fearful whispers about who had received a foreclosure notice that week. Men who had been friends for decades now avoided each other's eyes, ashamed of their shared predicament. The machinery dealerships, once the bustling centers of the boom, became ghost towns. Shiny, new million-dollar equipment sat on their lots, untouched, collecting dust. Rich Thompson was the first to fall, and the hardest. His empire, built entirely on the sands of debt and leverage, was washed away by the tidal wave of high interest and low prices. The bank that had once courted him, that had praised his aggressive vision, turned on him with brutal efficiency. They didn't care about his dreams or the sweat he'd poured into the land. They only cared about the numbers on a spreadsheet, and the numbers were all red. The auction notice appeared in the county paper, a full page printed in stark black ink. It listed everything: the John Deere 8820, the 8640 tractor, the planters, the discs, the grain trucks. It listed the land, parcel by parcel, including the old Hemlock place. It even listed his house. Everything was to be sold to the highest bidder on the courthouse steps. I saw Pete at the co-op a few days before the sale. His own farm was bleeding out, but he was hanging on by a thread. The swagger was gone, his face pale and drawn. "It's a slaughter, Silas," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "They're picking us off one by one. Rich, he put everything he had into it. He believed the experts. We all did." He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw genuine respect in his eyes. "You were the only one who didn't drink the Kool-Aid. You saw this coming, didn't you?" "I didn't see this," I said, honestly, gesturing around at the grim faces in the co-op. I just listened to my father. He always said that a farmer sleeps well when he owes nothing, even if his bed is hard. I survived because I had no debt. The drought hurt, but it didn't kill me. My property taxes were low. My input costs for fuel and seed were a fraction of what Rich was paying. When a bearing went out on my old International tractor, I didn't call a mechanic. I pressed a new one in myself using the vise in my shop. My farm was a self-contained ecosystem, lean and tough. While my neighbors were drowning in interest payments, I was treading water, battered but alive. My freedom wasn't in my profit margin. It was in my lack of a signature on a loan document. The old Massey 510 sat in the shed, costing me nothing but the space she took up, a silent red testament to the wisdom of owning your iron. The day of the Thompson auction was cold and grey, a November sky threatening a bitter winter. The entire county was there, it seemed, not in celebration, but in mourning. They stood in grim, silent groups on the courthouse lawn, their faces etched with the fear that their own auction might be next. This wasn't just the end of one man's farm, it was the funeral for an era. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man in a cowboy hat, stood on a flatbed trailer, his voice a sharp, rhythmic bark that cut through the heavy air. He started with the small items. Tools, welders, fuel tanks, they sold for pennies on the dollar. Men who desperately needed the equipment couldn't get the credit to bid on it. Then came the big iron. The magnificent John Deere 8640, the symbol of the boom, was driven onto the block. The bidding was sluggish, pathetic. It sold for less than a third of what Rich had paid for it 2 years earlier. The 82MT Combine, his pride and joy, went for even less. The bank bought most of it back, just to cut its losses. I saw Rich standing off to the side, near an old oak tree, his wife beside him. He was a different man. The tailored shirt and polished boots were gone, replaced by a worn work coat and muddy shoes. He looked thin, hollowed out, as his life's work was dismantled piece by piece. His wife was crying silently, her arm linked through his, the only thing holding him up. He wasn't a villain. He was just a man who had dreamed too big and bet on a game that was rigged against him. Finally, the auctioneer moved on to the land. He started with the outlying parcels, the ones Rich had bought at the peak of the market. They sold for half their purchase price, mostly to out-of-state insurance companies and investment groups, vultures circling the carcass of the family farm. Then he announced the last parcel. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the home quarter. 160 acres, with a 2-story farmhouse, barns and grain bins. The original Miller place. A hush fell over the crowd. This was it. This was his home. Rich closed his eyes. His wife buried her face in his shoulder. The bidding started low. A lawyer representing the bank opened at $500 an acre. Another bid came in at $550. The auctioneer worked the crowd, his voice pleading, cajoling, trying to squeeze blood from a stone. 600! Do I hear 600? $600 an acre for a prime piece of land with a good home? Silence. The bank was going to take it. Rich and his family would be out on the road by the end of the week. I thought of my father. I thought of his words about bankers and debt. But I also thought of his other lessons. Lessons about community, about neighbors, about decency. Being right wasn't worth a damn if you used it as a weapon. I took a deep breath. 650, I said. My voice was clear and steady. It carried across the lawn. Every head turned to look at me. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. Rich Thompson looked up, his face a mixture of shock and confusion. The bank's lawyer, annoyed, immediately bid 700. 750, I said, without hesitation. I had done the math 100 times the night before. I knew what the land was truly worth, and I knew what was in my savings account. The savings bonds I had bought with the profits from the '77 harvest. The money everyone thought I was a fool for not investing. The lawyer conferred with a man in a suit, then bid 800. 850, I called back. A murmur went through the crowd. This wasn't about the bank anymore. This was between me and them. The lawyer looked at me, then at his client, who gave a slight shake of his head. They had reached their limit. $850 an acre, the auctioneer shouted. Going once, going twice, sold to Silas Blackwood for $850 an acre. The gavel fell, and the sound echoed like a rifle shot across the silent lawn. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt a heavy sense of responsibility. I walked over to the clerk's table to sign the papers, my hand steady. When I was done, I walked over to Rich. He stood frozen, staring at me as I approached. Silas, I don't understand, he stammered. Why? After everything I said. Why would you do this? This is good land, I said simply, looking past him at the old farmhouse. It shouldn't be owned by a bank in Chicago. It needs a farmer. I paused, then looked him square in the eye. The house is yours, and your family's. You can rent it from me, for $1 a year. And I'll need a good man to help me work this new ground. I'll pay you a fair wage. He stared at me, his eyes filling with tears. The arrogant businessman was gone, and in his place was just a broken farmer. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, a wave of understanding and gratitude washing over his face. He reached out and shook my hand. His hand was no longer soft. It was the rough, calloused hand of a man who had finally learned the difference between price and value. The years that followed were hard, but they were honest. The farm crisis reshaped our world. Many families left. Their farms sold and consolidated into corporate holdings. But those of us who remained were different. We were survivors. The talk at the diner changed. Nobody bragged about their line of credit anymore. Instead, they shared tips on how to rebuild a carburetor or where to find a cheap bearing. Old paid-for machines were pulled from the weeds at the back of groves, patched up, and put back to work. A new respect for thrift, for maintenance, for self-reliance took root in the hard soil of our losses. Rich Thompson worked for me for 5 years. He was the best hired man I ever had. He learned how to weld, how to overhaul an engine, how to listen to the language of old iron. He taught me about bookkeeping and marketing. We became friends, forged in the quiet understanding of shared work and mutual respect. Eventually, he saved enough to buy a small farm of his own, miles away, a place where he could start over, smaller and smarter. I never got big. I bought another 80 acres when the price was right, paying cash for it. But I never forgot the lesson. I kept the old Massey 510 even after I bought a slightly newer, bigger combine. I'd fire her up once in a while, just to hear the sound of the Perkins diesel and to remember. One fall afternoon, years later, my grandson, a boy of 10, was with me in the shop. He was looking at the old Massey, parked in her place of honor in the corner. "Grandpa," he asked, "why do you keep this old thing? It's so small and rusty." I smiled and wiped a bit of grease from my hands onto a rag. I walked over and put my hand on the combine's faded red fender. "This machine," I told him, "is more than just iron. It's a lesson. Back when everyone else was borrowing money to buy bigger and shinier tractors, I was in here with a wrench and a grease gun, taking care of this one. They all said she couldn't handle it, that she was junk. I looked at the boy, making sure he was listening. But she wasn't just a combine. She was my freedom. She taught me that you don't build a life on what a bank will lend you. You build it on what you can hold in your own 2 hands. You own the iron, son, I said, repeating the words that had saved me. Or the iron owns you. He nodded, not fully understanding, but filing the words away. I knew one day he would. I looked out the big shed door, across the fields that were mine, truly mine, free and clear. The land was healed, the corn stood tall, and a quiet peace had settled over the valley. I had never become the king of the county, but I had survived. And in the heartland, survival is the only victory that truly matters.